So yeah, my name is Tony. I'm part of a company called Teclead. We have an office here in Berlin as well, one in Frankfurt. Today I want to talk about components as a service, which is basically architecture concept, which we are implementing for multiple well-known German brands as well as international brands. I hope you guys like the presentation. I'm super happy to have you here. If you have any question, let's discuss it at the end. And hopefully even someone joins me here for a live discussion would be cool. Yeah, so let's go and start. So my agenda. At first, I want to tell you something about the project situation which we faced with those clients, right? What kind of challenges did they have and what kind of architecture infrastructure setup was present there. So afterwards, I will tell you what kind of solution we came up with to solve that. And then in the middle of the presentation, I want to talk more about the front-end architecture itself, how authoring can be solved in that setup. And then at the end, we do a little bit of live demonstration in the browser, as well a little bit of live coding so that you guys can see what a developer actually would do to work in those kind of setup. And at the end, we do then the question. I will just check the sections. Can anybody say anything? Okay, I just wanted to check if everybody can hear me, but looks great. Okay, cool. So let's start. The project situation. This is the example brand which I will use through the whole presentation, right? So we're not talking about the real company. We use this one for the presentation. But the challenge which I am talking about was present on all of those brands. So it was always the same that you have one user interface, one web platform, which is used by the customers, right? But in the back end, you have multiple systems depending where you are on the platform. So the main thing there mostly was AEM for branding pages, landing pages, homepage, all that stuff. So on the lower bottom left, you see here brand.com, right? This is all the enterprise content management pages. Then on /shop of those brands, you would have something like some e-commerce systems because they sell online. And then you have 3 or 4 more systems. For example, the user area, which was in some cases a single page application, which is still on the domain, but it's again a totally different systems. And that is something what the user doesn't see, right? You shouldn't be able to notice it, but actually it's different technology, different teams. So looking at that again, the company uses multiple systems on one platform. This is important to keep in mind because that's the biggest problem they have, because this will cause redundant development work, right? You have different kinds of technologies in every system, different kind of teams working with it. And yeah, it's a lot of overhead and a lot of redundant implementations. If you imagine deployments, you will have a slow and synchronized and not synchronized release process. That means, let's imagine here on the brand page, you will see a small icon, which is a search, right? And let's imagine we develop that search for the AEM website and we want to launch it. If the user jumps to the e-commerce part, the search is missing. So if you want to do that, you have to make sure that the feature is implemented for all those environments and will be deployed for all those environments at once. And if you imagine now, okay, a hotfix or something like that, right? You have to roll back everything. So super painful. And you would be surprised like what kind of big known enterprise companies are going into or had this kind of setup, which evolved over years, right? Yeah. And one thing is important to know as well. We had no option for system migration because I think what most of you guys would do in that kind of setup is, okay, let's make sure that, for example, AEM is now the main system. Let's move everything into the system, but that wasn't the case here. We couldn't do that of political reasons. Also, it could be that it was a subsidiary company which was responsible for the e-commerce, which is, in that case, it was just not doable. Just make sure that everything's fine. Okay. Okay, redundant implementations, right? If you check out the page in general, and on the left, we have, again, AEM, in the middle of e-commerce, right, is basically the user area when the person is logged in. We have redundant front-end components like the navigation, product elements, and for example, the footer, right? This is everywhere the same. And what we try to solve now is that we have one development process regarding the system, and we have a synchronized deployment for all of those environments. That would be the ideal case to solve. So what kind of solution did we came up with? One option would be the migration, right? We already talked about that. This wasn't an option. The other thing we came up with was to make sure, okay, how can we remove all the front-end logics or front-end implementation out of those systems, make them in one technology, and deliver that as a, for example, as a dependency to all those systems, for AEM, for example. And the solution we came up with is called Frontend Service, which you will see here on the right side. This is basically a Node.js application, which is outside of those systems, right? So it's outside of AEM, outside of the e-commerce part. It's a separate service, and it's kind of like a REST service. It's dumb. It gives you answers when you ask something. And what it will do is you can ask the service, give me the assets for the navigation and the footer, for example. You will get back the assets for those service. So now we have one place, one front-end service, where a dedicated team is, which develops all components which are used in all of those brands. And we have one common technology. In that case, it was React, because this is what the company was already using. But you could also use something else. You could use normal JavaScript implementations, Angular, Vue.js. It doesn't actually matter. It's technology agnostic. So when you look at this, what are we solving now? So we have one release process for all systems, right? Because we're just developing a service, which I will show you in detail in the next slides. But we're developing one service. And if you ask the service something, you get back the result, right? It doesn't matter if you are the brand, so AEM, or the e-commerce system. You ask the service something, you get back information. In that case, you ask for specific assets, like JavaScript and CSS assets, and you get them back for specific components. Yeah, and all of those stuff is basically solved with that. One additional point at the bottom here is a feature which we implemented for some of those companies, which lets you deploy new front-end components without the need of deploying AEM anymore. So let's assume you have a new product hero component on your website, right? You basically just build it here in the front-end service, and it's available for all of those components. I will show you how that works at the end, but it's important to know this is an option. This is not mandatory. You can still develop the same way like you would normally do in AEM as well. So let's look at the pages, how it looks like in the AEM author, what is happening there. So if we look at the left page, we will see the navigation, like a product component in 3 different configurations. Normal AEM setup, an author puts data in it, and it renders differently, right? The important part is now, how does AEM know what it should do, what it should call, where does it get the assets from to render those components? And for that, we implemented an OSGI service. The service is just responsible for checking the page, and it basically does something like, okay, give me all components which are used on that site. So in that case, it's the navigation. It's 3 times the product component, but it doesn't matter because it's one component, and the footer. So what it will do now is it will call the front-end service and will say, okay, give me the assets for all of those components. Just post request with an array of apps, basically, and you get back the JavaScript and CSS assets, which you need to render all those components. And then the next part is basically putting the data from the author, which is stored in the JCR, into the components to render it properly. So again, the service checks the page, gets all components, asks the service to give the asset for running that, and then it injects the data. And the same concept applies for all of the environments. The only difference is that you have, depending on the environment, for sure, a little bit of a different implementation for that service, but that's just like one small service, which can be redundant. It's not so important that this 300 lines of Java code is totally strict dependency for all systems. So this will be developed depending on where you are. So that way you can do it in AEM and other content management systems, and even in single page apps which have no authoring capabilities. So to make it a little bit easier to understand, we look at the page component, right? If you imagine your page in AEM as a Sitely component, it will look like this. You will have on top Sitely include, which is a reference to our front-end service, so the OSGI service. We call it FS for front-end service, and we basically call it in the head and in the body. So here on the head, we just say, give me all the apps CSS includes, and on the bottom, we do the same, but for the JavaScript. And what do we ask for? We ask for those components here. So we ask for navigation, product, and footer, teaser, also product, teaser, and footer. And if you now check how it will look like rendered, basically, it will look like this, right? You have here your head, there you have your includes to the navigation CSS, this component, product teaser, footer CSS, all those components. On the bottom, the same, but for the JavaScript. Keep in mind that this is now a subdomain. So it's frontendservice.brand.com, where we host our stuff, right? This is basically our separate service. Most of the time, it's, let's say, an AWS server or like somewhere hosted, which is close to AEM, but it's on a different domain, and it has the assets for rendering that. And if you want to, you can also put your own OSGI models here to apply additional rendering logic to the navigation, for example. Okay. So one important thing to know is, or to notice is, if you look at the style tag here and the script tag here, and we compare it, here we include it directly with href, right, or as a script tag. But this can cause issues, right? Because you're on a separate domain, and sometimes companies don't like that because of how the infrastructure is there. And for that purpose, we also implemented the option, which is just a checkbox in an OSGI config, where you can say, I want to include it directly. This means we have no external domain calls here, but it will be rendered directly into the style tag and into the script tag. So here you will have your CSS, your JavaScript, and no calls anymore. Yeah, and this is an option you can do. This will look like this. So this is the one single OSGI configuration. Just check if everything's clear. Looks good. So if you check out the OSGI config, it's a little bit more understandable, I think, as well, because here we just put in the link basically to the domain where your front-end service is hosted. SSR means server-side rendering service. This is optional. This is something we provide when you, for example, have a lot of React apps or Angular apps, and you need to re-render it to have SEO requirements checked basically in your company department or in your SEO department. And here's what I said, the toggle functionality for the inline asset loading, right? If you compare again, directly loading something inline without reference to external domains, or just like this, which from my point of view is a little bit cleaner and shouldn't be a problem if it's a separate domain, but if you want to, you can have it rendered here directly. So I don't want to talk too much about how components are rendered, because I would say most of you guys and most of the companies who use AEM, already use some kind of React integration or Vue integration or whatever you guys use, or web components. But I just want to talk briefly about the Sitely component in general, because I want to explain how simple it is. Because what the component structure in AEM just looks like is the component folder with the XML for the dialog and the reference to our resource supertype. The Sitely template for this component looks very, very simple. It's just an empty div. Again, we have a reference to the front-end service, and we render here the name of the component dynamically. That's important to know. And this is important for rendering the JavaScript apps. And here we inject the data from the author. And this can be overwritten for sure. So if you want to add, again, your own logic here, because you have some inheritance in the navigation or whatsoever, you just put in a Sling model here as a JSON or something like that, and then the component can be rendered and everything is good to go. If you want to know anything about that more in detail, I think the slides of the talk will be available here somewhere, and then here is basically a link to my last year's presentation where it's more about rendering those components. So authoring, that's the fancy part, because like I said, you can switch around between having internal HDL dialogs, or not HDL, but touch UI dialogs, and the external one. And the question is, why should we actually do that? We shouldn't do that always, that doesn't make sense, but we have some cases where it makes a lot of sense actually. So imagine your company, and that's I think the case for most of the companies, you have authors which work in AEM. So they are used to the touch UI dialog, that's it, right? They work with it, good to go. Sometimes when you have that setup with multiple brands, a team of authors can be responsible for the whole platform instead of, let's say, one technically vertical, right? Which also makes no sense, because sometimes you're responsible for the marketing, product, and user area because you work in the journey of the whole customer. So in that way, you have a different dialogue depending on the system, and it would make sense to have one unique experience there, because then every component is configured in the same way. And for those kinds of cases, we have this option. So it's basically an external hosted dialog. Everything's still same like an AEM. You store data in the JCR and read it from the JCR. But this option is required if you want to have this dynamic component list when you don't want to deploy AEM anymore for front-end components, but you can just keep, it's important to know, you can keep your touch UI dialog. You don't have to do that. It's just an option which I want to show you. So again, touch UI versus unified is basically a question of how the authors work, but the rest of the setup is the same. How it works is basically like a post request to a Sling servlet, storing it directly on the node and reading it. So same like a touch UI dialog. And it makes more sense now if I just show you what I mean with that in the demonstration. Hope everything is clear. Okay, some questions already there. We'll answer that afterwards. So now I want to show you how it will look in the author. For this, I will just go to the retail page, just reload to make sure that I'm still logged in here on my local AEM environment. So this environment is connected to the front-end service, so the external hosted components, right? It's not the components we see now are not in AEM. So let's add one. It's just very simple for demonstration purposes, but let's use the first one with an internal hosted dialog. So everything is like normally. So what do we have here? We have an empty div, or not an empty div, we have a div with a background color, super simple. Text, here's a state, which is basically a timer which goes up, and it's just for indicating that the component is working, and when you adjust with it now, that it doesn't break the state. So just for making sure everything works, we show it to you. Then we have the parsys and the image, and that is now the cool part in my point of view, because I'm still using a parsys, I'm still using image components, so AEM core components, even though the component is not even hosted in AEM. And the editing still works like normally. Right, I can open something here in the dialog. I put my cool text here. And I will also add an image. Click store, it should be there directly. Component re-renders, just to show you the state. And now I can also put, for example, another core component in the parsys. Inline editing still works. The component still renders. And here's the image core component, right? I can also directly leverage that, use it, edit it inline, everything like normally. So the fancy part is now basically how it looks like for a React developer or like a front-end developer. One thing to know is when I show you this now, one thing for us, or for me especially, when I come up with a concept like that, for me it's super important, and for the whole team, that we build something which is not a crutch, right? Even though the architecture concept might look like a little bit new or confusing for you when you hear it the first time, but the architecture is not what the developers work with. The developers work with what they deliver to them, and that is the front-end service. That is something like this. So we always try to keep it as close to something they already know, and in that case, it's mostly create React app. If you're a React developer, or like a normal Angular setup, which you could have here, and you have the server, and the server is the front-end service, which basically just the Node.js application. You actually don't develop that, you just run it, but depending on what you want to do, some companies, for example, use that also to implement their search functionality for AEM, or like for search, which is used somewhere else as well, because you can quite easily do it here in the Express application. For React developers, it's like every other project. You have your source folder, you have some components, and that's it. Now let's look at the example which I just showed you here, right? Blue div with some small elements inside of it. That is this component here. It's important to know that it's a standard React component. It's class-based, right? It's not functional-based. You could do it as well, but in that case, it isn't. Here we have our empty div, or not like our div with some elements inside of it. Text. This here, this.props.text is what we just saw from the dialog. So this here, my cool text. If you check out the JCR, make a smaller reload. Here's a component. You see text, my cool text. And this is what is automatically injected in the component. So the front-end developer, when he creates something like this, you don't have to take care about building a Sling model, inject it somehow in the component. With the setup we built, it's directly there. Here's the image. And this is now the fancy part where we use the AEM core components as well as the parsys directly here in the React implementation, which is outside of AEM. So you just use our AEM component here, just an import from comments. And then you give it a name. So here it's parsys1, image1, and that is basically what is stored in the JCR. So when we check it out again, we see here child node of the components is parsys1, image1, image is the image component, parsys has a title, and this is used here. And the cool thing is, if you imagine this now in a bigger setup, I don't have to deploy AEM now to do any changes. I can adjust my text here. And I can also, let's say, move the parsys with a title up in the component directly under the H2. I click save, and it should, hopefully my Mac didn't froze it, but because it's open for so long, but it should hot deploy. So whenever I just do a reload here now, here's my new text. The parsys element was moved to the top. In this way, the front-end developer can work in its well-known setup, builds component, doesn't care about actually knowing a lot of stuff in AEM. And even if known AEM developers sometimes say, hey, why I know all of that, that's true, but let's say AEM developers are very rare. And if you can open up the AEM ecosystems for more developer, you will be very much or a lot more efficient as a company, recruiting, building up your teams. If you say, hey, you're coming directly from university, you know React, bam, let's go, here's your setup. Now you can work for AEM and some other systems as well, but you just simply do this here, right? You still have some backend developers in AEM which help you setting everything up, maybe building some dialogs, but the core of the brand can be built in modern technology and reused quite heavily. Now I just want to show you real quick the last example of that, and this is the here adaptTo example 2. This is a different setup which I just noticed. where even the dialog is shipped from the outside. So you can, if you want to, deploy new components without deploying AEM, and you can deliver the same UI, the same dialog UI for all environments, even though it's not AEM. So this is a little bit different because you have one component, you put it on the page, and then the first time you open it up, it will look like this. You have some components here, and you choose which one you want to have, right? I just use that simple example here. Click Save, and then the component is rendered. If I open it up again, or I could do it directly, but if I open it up again, this dialog is different now, right? Because now it's a dialog for that specific component. And if you check it here, please add a title. I put value here, it's directly rendering, and this dialog here is shipped from the outside, and this can be done in all systems. We still store everything directly in the JCR, but you could reuse that dialog now for a lot of environments, and you can make your components reusable in the whole enterprise, which was a goal for that. Now I think the question is, how do you build the dialogues? If you were present on my last year's talk, there I explained or showed an example of something similar like the component generator, which was shown this year. We had something like this from before already. And this is also used for the other components. So this was a component we just saw, right? It's like an H3, and this was a title which we just saw from the dialog. And in the same folder, you have dialog.ts, which is your dialog. The good thing is you don't have any YAML files, you don't have any XML files, which are not validated. You know what you get because we have TypeScript interfaces here everywhere. So let's assume I want to have an additional field here. I just copy it in the field array. I can't do any mistake. If I put anything random here, like this, it will complain that type needs to be a specific one. So the type of the field can be, for example, a multi-field. You see it's already shown what you can do in image whatsoever. In that case, we use text area maybe. The database name is what is stored in the JTR. So here's title already. So nice. Let's call it my text area. Something like that. Just save. I hit my yarn build dialogs command, and I'm done. If I check now, if I check now dialog again, we see my title, and here's my text area and my checkbox. So this way I can deliver those dialogs directly to all of those systems, and the storing functionality is dynamic. So there you don't have to tell AEM that you want to store that structure. It's directly storing it through a servlet, through a service, and that's actually it. So small repeat. This is basically what developers work with. They work in their React components folder like in every other React project. The server will be just used. It's not really for developing it. And then depending on what you want to do, you decide if you keep everything in AEM like you normally would, or you have that dynamic thing where you also can push new components to different environments without doing a big AEM release. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. The last part of it is just the FAQ. I just want to answer some questions which we actually get always whenever we present it. So does everything needs to be in the front-end service? No, like you saw it already, right? We have this retail page. There are some slightly components, some of those new architecture. You can mix it, it doesn't matter. It works with core components, right? We used the if you remember, we used here the image component, here the image component as well. The parsys now move to the top, and this works. Performance, this is always an issue when you talk to architects, but there is no performance bottleneck for the reason that if you imagine how the page is rendered in AEM, right? There's a page, it was rendered, and then it is cached in the dispatcher, right? And that's happening here as well. The page is rendered, called while rendering the front-end service. Afterwards, it's cached. So when it's in the dispatcher cache, the front-end service can go to sleep. It's not needed anymore. Whenever you invalidate the cache, then for sure the service will be asked once to give the new assets. But other than that, there's no real performance issue because everything stays like that. And can we use a touch UI dialog because we don't like the other one? Sure, I just showed you that. This also works. Yeah, I hope I am still in time. I think so. Yeah, if you have any questions, these are my contacts. Yeah, I'm in the Berlin office. This is my email. If you have any question, last year's I actually got a lot of them. I was surprised about that. And hopefully you guys have more questions now in the comment section. So I will check that out now. Okay, I see some, I have 1 minute left. So if I check the question and answers, I see what solution did you use to hook together React and AEM editors events, a custom script? We basically, when you use that one container, we override some scripts there. It's an overlay, like an apps, right? We overlay something. We just check if it's our dialog, then we do something. Otherwise, we keep it like it is. Okay, how do you manage in author edit mode the JS dependencies for new included components without reloading the page? Yeah, depending on how you want to do it, you can directly load the assets in the component sections, depending on where you are. It's basically just some JavaScript implementations. If you need help there, I can check that out. Many questions. So how do you manage in author edit mode the JS CSS dependencies for new included components without reloading the page? Okay, that's what we just said. How do you manage that all front-end components are using the same frameworks? That's a good question. That's quite easy to solve. It's we do it mostly like that we don't use, let's say, React as a dependency while building Webpack, or for sure it's a dependency, but we say to Webpack it's an external dependency. What we do is we bound React to the window, also to the DOM. So if you actually go to one of those companies and you do window.react, you will see the dependency React itself there. And all components use the React basically from the window. So you have only loaded it once. And you have always the same version. Benefits of using web components. There are no benefits. You can use whatever front-end technology you like. This is not like a proposal to use React. This was just in that example. Yeah, that's actually it. Okay, I did not understand completely. How do you tell the backend service which JS component files to load? So we have a Java implementation. It's an OSGI service, and when the page is rendered, the service will scan basically the page, so the JCR, and checks what kind of components are used by the author. So, okay, the navigation, some other elements, and the footer. Then it has a list of those components. Then, before the rendering is executed, it will ask the service, please give me all the assets for those apps, post request, and we get back as a response with the JavaScript. And this is what we put on the bottom, on the head of the page, and then rendering continues. And it's only happening one time, right? It's cached afterwards. Yeah, and I think that are all my questions. Super happy to have so many questions here and still some visitors. Yeah, thank you very much. This was my presentation. If you have anything else, Tony Schumacher at Teclead.de, and yeah, hope you guys still have a good day and the rest of the adaptTo conference.